And I think over the course of this conversation, we'll make these connections to Jim Crow and racism in the US and casteism in India. But according to this apocryphal myth, Brahma's body, the great creator god, kind of gave this model where there were 4 varnas or castes, and so the Brahmins were supposedly in the head, the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, is the arms, and then you have the Vaishyas, the merchants, or the legs, and the Shudras, the laborers, are the feet. And the idea is that all of these parts need to work in tandem to create a kind of healthy social political body.
I want to welcome all of you to tonight's discussion, which is focused on one of the world's most enduring forms of oppression and hierarchy, caste. My name is Phillip Martin. I'm a senior investigative reporter here at GBH. And we have a distinguished panel of experts on this issue who I will introduce shortly. But before we do, just a few words about tonight's topic. Casteism. Now, that's something that most of us were not talking about a few years ago. But this discussion, in many ways, I guess you could say, was inevitable. This had to happen. And in this moment, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Origin. Anyone in the audience sees? Okay, let's talk about this for just a second. This movie is, you could say, it's propitious because it's showing in theaters around the world right now based on Isabel Wilkerson's celebrated and controversial book, Caste. And controversial for a lot of reasons, which I think our panel might get into, but it follows the writer, Isabel Wilkerson, around the world as she investigates 3 main permutations of this form of hierarchy: race and caste and violence in the United States, the connections of U.S. hypersegregation and violence to the Nuremberg laws and Nazi Germany, and the persistence of caste in India, where it all began and where it continues. My own journey in exploring this issue of caste started at the 2001 Conference on Race in Durban, South Africa, which I was reporting on as a correspondent for National Public Radio at the time. My feature story was slated to run on NPR's All Things Considered the afternoon of September 11th, 2001. So needless to say, it was scrapped. It never saw the light of day or heard by anyone. But I was able to revisit the issue years later here at GBH, and perhaps only at GBH. Did I knock that down? I did. Perhaps only at GBH could you have produced this series, Caste in America, which was produced in conjunction with the Pulitzer Center, a 5-part report bringing together journalists Tinku Ray, Kavita Pillai, our own Arun Rath, and myself to explore this ancient division that made its way into Indian and Nepali communities here in the United States. Now, much of the content for this series was based on the pioneering academic work of Larry Simon at Brandeis University, who initiated annual conferences, the most recent being a few months ago, on caste and casteism in the subcontinent and elsewhere when few Americans were looking seriously at this issue. Larry also launched something called Caste Journal, the first academic journal of its kind just a few years ago. And I'd like to have Larry Simon stand up for a second to be acknowledged. Larry, where are you? This is Larry Simon right here. Now, others in Boston also laser focused on this issue, including members of the Boston Study Group. Tonight we explore caste, including for many of you who are just becoming familiar with the term, its impact and how it manifests in India and the United States. Isabel Wilkerson's argument, an argument that also was made, we should say, in the 30s and 40s, but sort of lost got lost in the academic sauce somewhere. Here tonight to discuss caste and casteism are Tufts University professor of English, Ravi Shankar, whose new book, Correctional, explores race, shame, the criminal justice system, and what it means to be a brown man in America. He is the founding editor of the online literary journal Drunken Boat and has been called a diaspora icon. Also with us tonight is GBH's own Arun Rath, host and executive editor of GBH's local All Things Considered. His story in our series on PRX's The World introduces us to B.R. Ambedkar, the very founder of the movement against casteism, against untouchables, as they were called in those days. The term now is Dalit. And Arun visited a street in New Jersey named after the Dalit activists. Suraj Yengde, featured in Isabel Wilkerson's movie, Origin, by Duverney, but based on Isabel Wilkerson's book, is one of India's leading scholars and public intellectuals. He's the author of Caste Matters, currently the W.E.B. Dubois Fellow at Harvard University this year, and he's completing his second PhD this year at Oxford University. Our moderator this evening is Chellamal Keshavan, a current master's in public policy candidate at the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts. She has for a long time explored the intersection between what is happening on the subcontinent among Indians and Black Americans in the U.S., I should say Black Americans, and those Black folks in the diaspora. And I'd like all of you to join me in a round of applause for our panel. And I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, Phillip. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I have been excited about this evening for probably weeks now, and so I think a part of me is just sort of taking it all in this moment. Like Phillip said, I'm going to be your moderator this evening. I am humble and excited to be joined by panelists such as these guys. I am a Tufts student. I am one of the neighborhood fellows. Some of my colleagues from our program are in the audience tonight, and my student life at Tufts is a large part of the reason why I met Ravi. There are some textbooks that feel more exciting than others. Last summer, I was in our bookstore shopping for what I was supposed to be buying when I stumbled upon Correctional, and my brain went, South Indian. Definitely heard this name before, Ravi Shankar, I've heard that. And then I realized that he was exploring issues of racial justice, thinking about the sort of criminal justice system, carceral issues, and I went 100%. I need to read this. And within a week, I had read the book, I had met him, and we were sort of connected in some work at Haley House. And the rest is history. Here we are. We've been in conversation about how to lift this narrative. So I'm so excited to be here doing exactly that. What can I say about the book? I think my sort of elevator pitch has been that the book covers a narrative of a South Indian who walks straight into Bloomberg stop and frisk, and what happens thereafter is sort of 10 years of interacting with the criminal system and how it sort of unravels his day-to-day, but it also covers thinking with a South Indian lens, I would say. So I think we'll open our discussion with a review of Correctional, and then we'll sort of lean into our lived experience to kind of inform the book, and then we'll lean on Suraj to share his theoretical perspective to back it all up, if that works. Does that sound good? Yeah, okay, great. So, Ravi, I'm gonna lean into you to start. There's a particular moment in the book where you have just been pulled over, and you're in New York City, and you're getting ready to drive home to Connecticut for the evening. You're leaving a party, and you think you're with your cousin, and the officer sort of says, "Show me your ID," something to that effect, and you say, but officer, I'm a professor. Right? And I was lucky enough to attend India Rising this weekend, and I attended a lunch and learn with Suraj, and he sort of spoke to South Indians holding a dual kind of identity and wanting to lean into the capacity to be marginalized when it's convenient, and also to have an established dominant identity when it's convenient. And so when Ravi says, but officer, I'm a professor, it sort of feels evocative of exactly what Suraj is mentioning in that moment. So I wonder if you might speak to that.
Sure. Thank you all, and thank you, Chelly. It's wonderful to be on this panel. And yeah, not the right thing to say to an officer. You probably shouldn't say anything at all, in fact, when you're stopped. But yes, that introduced this class element. But before we do, I thought maybe just because there are some people here that might not know too much about the caste system, Suraj, of course, is the expert, but just to give you a little thumbnail sketch, you might know it's an ancient form of social organization dating back almost 3,000 years. And you know, the Aryans, when they came, wanted a form to kind of oppress and govern the people. And so there is this connection to the Vedas. And I think over the course of this conversation, we'll make these connections to Jim Crow and racism in the US and casteism in India. But according to this apocryphal myth, you know, Brahma's body, the great creator god, kind of gave this model where there were 4 varnas or castes. And so the Brahmins were supposedly in the head, the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, is the arms, and then you had the Vaishyas, the merchants, or the legs, and the Shudras, the laborers, are the feet. And the idea is that all of these parts need to work in tandem to create a kind of healthy social political body. Of course, it left out an entire realm of people, the Dalits. And it is, I think, and this is what the contention that Isabel Wilkerson makes, is that it is not something that you see because it is sight itself in a way. That caste predetermines the way that we engage with each other, shapes our institutions. And I must say, it has taken me, and Arun can probably speak to this too, a long time to realize, because my story, I'm what they call an ABCD, an American-born confused AC. And so I was born in Washington, D.C. My father was one of the first Asian immigrants who, after the landmark immigration law of 1965, was allowed to come to this country, because we probably all know that the history of America has really discriminatory, from the anti-Chinese exclusion acts to the quota systems that existed for who could come into this country. He came over in the late 1960s to go to Howard University, actually, which I always thought was Harvard as a kid. But no, he was at Howard right in the middle of the civil rights movement when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and there were the riots and the National Guard was sent in. But I was kind of born in D.C. and as the top caste, the Tamilian Brahmin, in fact, there are these kind of like jatis, these even within the Varnas, hundreds and thousands of different kind of social stratas that determine your profession, who you can socialize with, who you can marry, and they're meant to be these kind of inflexible categories. And so here I was at the top caste, but in the Northern Virginia community that I lived in, I was the bottom caste. I was kind of not, I was the only South Asian family, our family, in Manassas, Virginia. And so I was not really even part of the social order that existed as much as I wanted to assimilate. So that moment, I think, in New York really put into stark relief the kind of role. And I think this book maybe is a little different because I feel like I'm someone who's benefited from enormous privilege throughout my entire life, and yet I'm also someone who has been discriminated against because of the color of my skin. And so the vantage that I have perhaps kind of looks at both sides of that. So I don't think that really answered your question, but.
No, but you can continue on to answer the question.
Well, yes, I mean, I won't say too much about this, but I think it would be interesting for all of us to maybe talk about our first realization of caste. I think I was very young. Though I was born in the U.S., I went back to India a number of times, and I remember being a young boy, and my parents were just, my family in India totally middle class, and they had servants. And I remember as a young boy asking my grandmother, like, well, and my grandmother's like, oh, they're part of the family. I'm like, oh, but they don't sit with us and eat with us. They take their food at the back door. Like, what do you mean they're part of the family? And so that was what first kind of got me understanding that there was this really kind of rigid social stratification that existed. Of course, in my own life, I wanted to just assimilate. I was an American. I'm born in the U.S. I just kind of wanted to be an American. And so the tension of this, on the one hand, being taught this idea of kind of exceptionalism, and on the other hand, being discriminated against, I think was a kind of through line in my childhood that I pick apart a little bit in the memoir. Suraj, do you want to say more about caste? Just a very brief kind of sketch. You can add so much more, obviously.
I want to really give a shout out to WGBH, and in particularly Phillip Martin, for really pioneering this conversation of our time in popular media. He was the first who thought about it at this times, but the history that he may perhaps now know, but before, has been quite intense. The African American intellectual space has been wrestling with this question of caste, and the word caste was part of their diction. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to go speak at the town of Great Barrington, where W.E.B. Dubois was born, and I'm giving a keynote and he himself was a kind of somebody who was interested in this very concept of caste, what it meant. But also I would like to give a shout out to Larry Simon as well for his really important and significant work, and he's been doing it with very minimum resources. I know how he manages, so thank you, Larry, and also for the excellent team. And I can see the family is here as well. The particular what in a way, the way we discuss about caste is mostly to exemplify a certain identity for their recognition, either by recognizing them as worthy or by just not giving them that respect and denying it. And the history is so interesting, because when Ravi was saying about there were servants in the house, and I just thought of my grandmother, who was one of the servants in someone's house. And I think that's the kind of hierarchy that it places. And in this episodic kind of interaction, caste migrates as well, because there is nothing that prohibits it. There's no legislation, there's no particular reading of history that will educate. And the very disastrous impact of caste, the way it was, for example, implemented in America, was especially in the South, the American South during the pre-Civil War, but of course after Civil War, and there was enormous. And so the caste basically here could mean anything, could mean the hierarchical society that is endogamous, and where resources of a certain community are preserved into that community that person is born, and the community represents vis-a-vis a dimension of caste. And your entire identity and experience is predicated on the womb that you take birth from. And so if the womb is of a certain recognizable character, you might carry that identity. And so it's really not in your control, you just carry it. And so that kind of becomes a metaphor for a person to live, and it's very coded. In certain societies it is color, in certain societies what Dubois calls color caste. It is color as well as caste, which means kind of including class aspect of it. And so there are much more hierarchies that it develops, and the phenomenal outcome of caste is that it produces multiple subcastes. So there is not just one, but there are many subgroups. And so you go divide, and in fact the idea of jati basically is identifying that subcaste. And then there is identification when it comes to marriages. you have to be from not subcaste but sub-subcaste, and that's where the idea of gotra, for example, becomes, which is basically finding lineage. In fact, a friend of mine, he got married, but in Rajasthan, and his brother was supposed to be married, and the parents were very consistent about mentioning that we want to find a person of this gotra only. They were Dalits, but they were Hindu Dalits, so they were very much conditioned by how the Brahminical society kind of puts it, and I think that's how I think the society operates in caste system.
Thank you, Suraj. Arun, do you want to jump in on this question?
Yeah, I would say, for me, my awareness of caste has really been emergent, and because it's been a very long, gradual process. Being myself Indian American, Brahmin, took me a long time to realize my sense of privilege, and again, also growing up as a brown guy in America. For Indian Americans, I think of the modern generation, or Indians probably in general, the modern generation, those of us who take some pride of India and modern India, and India throwing off the shackles of colonialism. That kind of modern Indian movement, they pay a lot of lip service to Ambedkar and to untouchables and Dalits, and Gandhi talked a lot about the Dalits, and even invented his own name for them because he loved them so much.
Harijan.
Yeah. So I was able to, I think, grow up with this kind of fiction that, modern India, modern Indians, we've fixed caste. That's something that is, and almost like something that when you're trying to establish a sense of pride, maybe in a different country, you kind of don't want to talk about that stuff even more for those reasons, and it's easier to be in denial about it. Growing up as an Indian American, also on top of that, thinking that I didn't believe in caste and that caste wasn't important to me, caste was at the same time hugely important to me. When I was 13 years old, Brahmin boys go through a ceremony, it's called a thread ceremony. And this is where basically Brahmins are the priest caste. This is where you are becoming, a boy becoming a man, but not like a bar mitzvah. It's more of a man becoming a priest, and really more of a man becoming a Brahmin, very specifically. So while for me as a young person, especially as I became a teenager and became more racially and culturally aware of myself, that was actually a source of pride for me. Because there was a sense, and I talked about this going back a long time with African American friends, with Black American friends, that this sense of, like the African Americans will talk about, in Africa we were kings, right? And so it's like, yeah, in India I was a priest, I was a prince or whatever in India. But as Chris Rock said, we weren't all kings. And it took a long time. And I'll go to one moment of realization and then maybe stop for a bit. But for me, I think the biggest moment of realization as a young person was when I went to India for the first time as an adult. This was when I was 23 years old. And I flew into Delhi, where my cousin was in college at the time, and met my cousin at the airport. And this was, you can imagine, I'm 23 years old. I haven't been to India since I was a baby.
Wow.
Hugely amazing thing for me, and especially, growing up in America, have this connection, see my cousin, I'm just, my head is spinning. So many emotions. We get to his flat in New Delhi, and greeted by the servant. And even though we're a poor Brahmin family, my cousin goes to college with a servant from the family, his butler, they called him, supposedly fondly. And he greets us at the door with a big namaskar, and I just go right back to him with the same gesture. And he looks at me like there's something wrong with me. Like I'm nuts, like I'm completely crazy, that why would I recognize his Godhead? And I felt this crushing feeling in my chest at that point that India's not what I thought it was. Hinduism is not what I thought it was. And it's funny, I've had, this experience has been had by Western people who study Hinduism in India, and they're like, sometimes their first trip to India, you hear this, you've probably heard this a lot of like, and when I get to India and then I see how people are actually treating each other, and it's like, yeah, the scriptures are different. And those things that we hold on to, and the reason it's hard, I don't want to sound like whiny, like, it's hard to be a Brahmin, but the realization that was hard about that was that, again, these things that are a source of pride and identity are things that are actually sources of poison. And these structures which we have maintained in ways that I didn't come to realize until I was doing the reporting along with Phillip, and thanks to Phillip and thanks to Suraj that I more recently learned in greater depth about this. But our religion itself, you talked about the Vedas. The Bhagavad Gita, like the core fundamental text of Hinduism and Hindu morality, a fantastic work, contains a justification for the caste system right there in it, in the core of the philosophical argument. And you can take it's about doing your duty, and you can take this interpretation like it's really about following your bliss, but it's about doing your job. And it's right there. So it turns, yeah. So
and it's a kind of interesting parallel that that Cotton Mather used the Bible to justify slavery, right? Other priests, there is this way, and that's, I think, what is so insidious about caste is that Isabel Wilkerson kind of describes racism as a subset of caste in some ways, and that's why she's able to compare Nazi Germany to India to Jim Crow, because it's almost this system of subjugation and dominance that appears like natural order or law, so that it's internalized and people act almost reflexively in response. And so there's this unconscious manifestation. And so similarly to you, I mean, I think for me growing up, just this idea of like, you are special, you're being treated like crap at school, but you actually are kind of extraordinary in some way, was almost a source of refuge that I then came to be, quite ashamed of, because I realized the only reason I was born in America is because my father was a higher caste. He was a Brahmin. He was able to go to university and study because he didn't have to toil in the fields. And as a result, he was able to make the journey. And I was born in this country. So there were so many ways in which caste has inflected my life that I hadn't been aware of as a child.
So I feel like I've heard both Arun and you, Ravi, touch on this. You talk about being treated like crap at school. Would you argue that there's a specific Desi experience of going to school in what might be predominantly a black-white dichotomy? I know for me, I was the only Indian kid in my public school system until I was in 8th grade. And it meant that I largely found spaces of love, spaces of support within blackness, and largely also from black women, right? And so I don't know if I can say that through and through for whiteness. And so it colored what school meant for me, and it colored where I told myself were safe spaces. So I wonder how that's
tracks on Arun's. I mean, my own experience, and of course, as any immigrant child, you have the cafeteria moment. I mean, my mother used to make me these delicious thali meals with sambar and vades, and every day on the way to the bus stop, I would dump it out. Because I had been teased. I was embarrassed to have this Indian food and and now what I wouldn't do for one of those meals. So there is a way in which I think in Northern Virginia, I was kind of an oddity. I wasn't really quite accepted by the white kids, but then the black kids grew up in different neighborhoods and they had their own affinities, and so I was kind of a little bit outside. I mean, I was kind of friends with everyone, but I didn't really quite fit in anywhere, I think.
Yeah, I think probably a similar experience growing, I grew up in Southern Maryland, kind of in a similar time. And Yeah, I mean, it was just a different kind of weirdness. I went to Southern Baptist schools up until I was in 7th grade. Because my parents wanted to send me to a private school, and the ones that they could afford were these Southern Baptist schools, and they were like really intense. And so to have like a religion where your gods have too many arms and you have too many gods, it's very, very different. But something that was, things have also changed a bit, and I've talked to younger Indian Americans, and there were aspects of privilege for sure in that as well. Not just talking about the Brahmin thing, because there was a time where there were just not that many Indians, especially like in the Mid-Atlantic at that time, the 70s and 80s. So there was a way in which I felt outside of the black and white racial dynamic, which was very intense, in the not too deep South at that time. And I noticed growing up that, well, like you to an extent, more of a kinship with African Americans, because like there was typically like maybe one other Indian kid in the entire school.
Sure.
And these Southern Baptist schools, like nothing. It was like only the people of color there were African Americans, and that was, and that translated also into a kinship growing up as well, as that there weren't many Indian American action heroes or anything. So like black Americans would be like the heroes.
I remember you told me you used to like Apu.
Yeah, well, I mean that's another thing that I figured out with like younger Indian Americans. Like I used to think Apu was awesome because like that was the first Indian that we had on TV. And I was like as a teenager when The Simpsons came on, and well, first off they were being ironic, and I thought they were being clever about it, but like he was actually they were portraying an Indian on TV, and I thought he was awesome, and I had to have finally younger people who had grown up being called Apu, or or even or worse, having their asses kicked for being Indian, to explain to me why that was hurtful, why that kind of particular.
Doing his voice.
Hari Kondabolu had to explain it to me. It was I was that bad, but there was a degree to which while I was seen as maybe colored, I was not black, and so weirdly, white people would be very comfortable being racist as hell around me. And so there was this kind of almost an observer position that I had that was it doesn't feel like it's that way anymore, and I think it's been that way just as there have been more Indians and we're more seen as a group, and maybe even more as more of a threat.
If I might just add, the other thing about caste, I think that Wilkerson makes the point of is that it's bad for everyone that's enmeshed in its system, right? Because it predetermines in some way what you're capable of. It dampens the human imagination. And there's a certain deprivation to caste privilege. So while it's nothing like, growing up as a Tamilian Brahmin, a Tambram, as they say, I was had to be a total vegetarian, forbidden from eating meat. I shouldn't have any alcohol. I shouldn't consort with the opposite sex. It's it's not very fun to be a Brahmin. And all of these beliefs, because I was being raised in the US, were just kind of put on me and I would question them, of course, because I naturally questioned everything, but I could never get any kind of justification except, that these are the customs you needed to keep alive in some way.
Would you argue that makes the family unit your primary mechanism for connection? The nuclear family or maybe the extended family?
Yeah, I think so. And this is maybe where this whole idea of genetics comes in, but when I was in India, the family was everything, and you would have aunts and uncles all kind of staying in the same room together. Other people who were in your neighborhood were considered kind of part of your family. And what I didn't realize is that these neighborhoods were highly segregated in a lot of different ways. Where my grandfather grew up in Coimbatore, now I know they had built an untouchability wall.
Yeah.
That fell over and they put it back up.
And that's the thing. It's again the way that these poisons can persist, because family is great, right? But then you also get into that obsession with purity and bloodlines and such. My mother is English. My father married a white woman, which was a huge deal. He was disowned, but then things got better. It's clear that if my father had married out of caste as opposed to a white woman, that would have been far worse. That would have been would have been completely unacceptable. Like that's how even among people that think of themselves as progressive, liberal, good people, it's kind of shocking how how deep that poison runs, and in ways of which we don't acknowledge. A lot of Indian Americans don't want to talk about this. Really, really don't want to talk about this. Even for this event, I saw definitely negative comments online, which I was completely expecting. And I will say for myself, my own family. I mean, tonight here I'm just speaking for myself, but things are bad. These are things that really persist.
Well, and it's kind of also this religious justification, right? I mean, this idea that you have this karma, this debt from a previous life that's manifested in your current circumstance. And so, oh, well, these people, they did something in their past lives and they have to live out this term in this particular mode. And I mean, it's preposterous on the face of it, but this is what many people believe.
Arun, you mentioned bloodlines, and I am thinking about this movie, Origins. I am ostensibly a Dalit adopted by Brahmins, and so I've made this economic, social transgression in a very short period of time as a baby. And I think that Origins and Isabel's sort of Caste makes the argument that there are parallels in the Black experience and the Dalit experience. And one of my questions, especially for you, Suraj, is because of adoption, I lost language, I lost culture, and when you lose those things, you can no longer think in the way that the original population thinks. Hope, dream, those it's not available. And so I wonder if you might speak to all of those pieces, or some of them.
I skimmed through your proposal as well.
Oh, he read my proposal, you guys? That's so exciting.
I mean, to my experience, the adoption industry in India, it's if you go deep down, it's quite heartbreaking because there's a child and vulnerability, and oftentimes I can't back it up with statistics, but when people are adopting babies, they are really looking for the characteristics of a Brahmin or a dominant caste. And some of my friends who are conscious about it, they can go to the level of adopting a Muslim, for example, whatever background, And then you realize, how do we know the identity of these kids who have been abandoned or who have been at some point? I mean, unless parents hand over, we don't know the whole story. And I think this really explains to you how strict and how ingrained it is into the minds of people that even in IVF. The kind of, it's a big industry also in India again, where the semen of a man has to be of a certain Aryan, and this is popularized in films as well, where one guy apparently, film is called Vicky Donor, and he says that the doctor just mentions that, he's like, I don't want to donate anymore, I want to go, and he says, when you have the pure, to the effect of your Aryan blood, and the seeds will, and this is in demand. And that really gives you an example of how sinister such experiences are. And I don't think people necessarily do it with an intention of something. They just want their progenies to be like them. And the like them here is, what is your caste? Right. And of course, caste then comes up with various other manifestations, such as it's their habits, how will they be accommodated in the family. We have certain habits of eating certain kind of vegetarian food, and all of that kind of comes through it. And I think, probably your Chellamal, your work probably will be among the first ones to tell us about what it is to be a person who's adopted who's born as a Dalit and then becomes a child of a Brahmin parents, and what does it do? And granted that there were many progress, 1970s era especially, the left movement was strong worldwide, and there was certain kind of belief we would like to have a child, and even now. But to the extent of how the system works, in the sense of adoption agencies, for example, in India, there was one right next to where I lived, next to, and I just happened to have a friend from there. It was very interesting that they call it juvenile centers or something.
Sure.
And I'm not sure if they were all juveniles, but that's how it is framed, and it was almost like you see these kids. They are in a closed door, and by the way, run by a very prominent Brahmin woman, social servant. She's well known, and then they are closed into this. I don't want to call it cage, but the situation kind of reflect that. So it's very difficult to pass a judgment without being in the position, as opposed to what would you do if the child was just in a garbage bin, would have been eaten by dogs and stuff, or else supposed to be given life, but life of what dignity,
Yeah, I think also a piece that comes up for me is the power of the state, be it international adoption law, something like the Middle Passage that takes history from Black people, or this sort of American criminal justice issue.
You bring up the sinister part of caste, and it really is completely arbitrary. This is another point that Wilkerson makes. She's got a lot of great analogies in the book, and while there's some things I quibble with, I think that this idea that she talks about, that you're born into this system that predates you in some way, and that prefigures every aspect of your life, and there is nothing natural about it. And she makes the example, you could have caste on the basis of short people and tall people, right? We all know, biologists have known for over 50 years that race is not a biological category. It's one kind of chromosomal decision, and there are populations in Kenya that have more in common, more propensity for leukemia, and their closest genetic counterparts are in the middle of Kansas, right? So this grouping that we have, and in the US it's kind of based on skin color, but it is totally arbitrary. And so you could have the 14th Amendment that says racial discrimination is outlawed, and yet as long as caste persists, this kind of inequity will continue to persist. Do you want to talk a little bit more about your own childhood and upbringing? Because I think it's really pretty fascinating.
Sure. Is there a targeted question? Or do you
Well, what Suraj was saying, I think you are, have you thought a little bit about that? What is the kind of psychic weight, and what do you carry being a Dalit, kind of adopted into a Brahmin family, but then also raised in a Black neighborhood?
So I am a policy person, and so I don't know if I'm looking at it from that perspective. I am wondering, I'm very interested in nutrition, and so when he talks about the proposal that I shared with him, I am curious about a metabolic narrative. I'm curious about folks who are under-resourced transitioning into folks who are profoundly resourced, and in a rapid period of time. And so to the points made, suddenly you're in the US, suddenly you're in the Black-white dichotomy, and you're also a child to parents who don't know how to do that. And they don't have a framework, and so you're kind of navigating on your own and finding spaces that feel safe and loving, because that's what we all do.
And I have a question for you. Because there are these interesting parallels, and so if you might not know, in India they have what's called the reservation system, which is parallel to affirmative action here. And similarly, as there's been this kind of backlash, there are these kind of reverse castists, right? Do you mind speaking a little bit to that reservation system, how it's worked, and it's been in place? It was only supposed to exist for like 10 years, right? And it's kind of remained in place?
No, I think that's one of the, the deniers advocate, and I mean, it was proposed, but the condition was that the reasons for giving reservations won't be reasons in 10 years. And it never happened, and the kind of policy. But especially Dr. Ambedkar here, who's an architect of this policy in some ways, he was basically saying, he knew that the caste system is so rigid, continue, and every time it faces an opposition, it comes up with a new form. It's like an amoeba. It adapts and then, circulates within the community. And when asked questions like why would one find reasons for irrational things, like you, Ravi and Arun, you guys have realized that, and so like this is mindless and this is stupid. Let's move on. But then we still have a bunch of people who, for reason that they cannot qualify as a rationale, still hold on to it just because that ties them to something. And this anchor that they are looking for is often buried in extremely violent, gory episodes. But they don't want to be cognizant of that. They just want to be cognizant of what's giving them a better feeling. Reservation system is basically a constitutional quota system. I think India is by far the most progressive country when it comes to making a permanent quota by the act of constitution for people who have been marginalized. In America, they don't have that. It's not an act of House or Senate. It's what a company CEO or board thinks, and one day there's Black Lives Matter, and they say, what, let's increase the places, and there's not, they would decrease. So India, that's
gender too.
And so now in India we have so complex. In fact, we have quota. Because it's so sensitive. It's a very careful document, the Constitution. It looks for marginalization, not just for caste or gender. It looks for disabilities, and from very early on, it also looks for the regional dimensions. Because if you are from South India, when you go to North India, it's a different dynamics. It considers that. If you're, if you have served, if your relatives in the armed forces, it gives you a quota. If you are an NRI, your children want to study. So there are different kinds of quotas, but caste quota is the only one that gets more attacked. As we see here, the gender quota don't get as much attacked as much as the racial quota does get attacked. And I think that reservation system, the way it is formulated, is complex. It's not simply giving seats. People assume that there is a quota, you can apply, and then they will assimilate you. It's not a shop where you go and buy things. It's an extremely complex bureaucracy.
But it's also social. It's not just employment or class. Right? There's also this kind of social dimension that exists.
So the reservation system applies predominantly in two fields: education and jobs. Now the difficulty here we face is people who should get into education, and there is a quota for them. There are so many barriers created structurally. By the time they finish the line, they're already fatigued, and then the board or whatnot is already hell-bent on not hiring, because there's all presumptions. But anyway, you have to hire the person. Now the difficulty in implementing this quota across the circle is that the people who are responsible to hire are not generally from the castes that the advertisement, and so most oftentimes that the report is sent which is not found suitable candidate, even though it's a quota. You should be hiring according to word of law. And we just didn't find it. And then what happened to the interview? And they will create all the structural barriers. So I think similar, but here's the funny thing. The Harvard case of affirmative action, right? Yep. Asian American. And
Indian Americans were asked to sign on to that, and people reached out.
Exactly, and I was also kind of part of that whole conversation. And you will not be surprised, the people who hate reservation system in India, who came and got opportunities based on their brown color and all the affirmative action, are the ones who signed up in the Asian American petition, and you will see the alumni organizations of engineering colleges and other Indian groups, and you just think about how, and that's the argument how caste easily translates, is because you want to have dominance not in a localized society, but you want to have a dominance in global society. You want to become the next Brahmin of this nature. And then and when you see somebody else getting a position, your position is threatened because you're used to becoming a Brahmin. You're used to becoming a dominant caste who's going to be serving you. And I think this is a kind of complex debate it becomes.
So to that wonderful segue, education and jobs, reproducing dominant ideology. I wonder if, very briefly, each of you might share what you consider to be a call to action when we have 4 million Indians, 70% of which hold bachelor's degrees or higher, 15% of the sort of top CEOs are likely 2 million Brahmins. What might you say to these exact populations as a call to action? What are your comments? In closing.
Well, I will just make, I do think South Asians have been very bad at racial solidarity. In fact, if you look at the per capita income of Indian Americans, it's higher than any other ethnic group. And so in a way, been privileged to not think about this. And so my book, Correctional, is really about my unexpected encounters with the criminal justice system and some of what we all know theoretically, experiencing it firsthand and seeing how it has been kind of socially engineered in order to affect an entire generation of Americans in a way that's totally contrary to the spirit of the Constitution and democracy and all of the principles by which we like to think that we're living. And so it has made me an advocate for that kind of reform, whether it is decarcerating or finding new ways of engaging these kinds of social problems. That's one thing. And I teach at Tufts. It's local. There's a great program called Tupit that brings college classes into correctional facilities across Mass. And so I'll throw my hat into helping support these kinds of causes.
Thank you.
So I'm a journalist, so I'm uncomfortable with a call to action. But having said that, what I would say is that we need to talk. And as a journalist, need to report. Something that we should say clearly, because we're talking about caste and caste in America, is that we have imported this with us. There are caste discrimination is a thing that now happens in America, and that's how we did the whole series that Phillip spearheaded. That was a great education for me that this is actually a problem. So for me, it's about dialogue and reporting and getting the truth out there, because as I've said, like I'd say, even in my cohort, people don't like talking about this because it's uncomfortable and it's, part of our own, might think that we're, getting our dirty laundry out in the greater public, but you know what? We need to do that.
We need to do that.
And it's like, I'm an Indian American journalist who's pretty hip on stuff, and it took until a few years ago actually working with Phillip Martin and doing this for me to actually get a real understanding of this. I'm ashamed of that. That shouldn't have been the case. But that, I guess, would be the call to action for me then, is
Thank you.
To do more reporting, do more truth-telling.
Last few words, Suraj, and then we'll move to questions.
I think we should, we should push back upon the ideologies that are trying to justify the existence of caste, not just in India but elsewhere too. And oftentimes they come across to us, with a very sob story that sounds appealing, but we have to probe more strongly. Like if we don't put that into check, then we'll have alliances against this kind of Asian American experiment, and it might appear a very innocent, pure work, but we need to probe the questions of what it is. I mean, what it is that people are ready to bury down the humanity of other people, as opposed to just holding on for the simple reason their own privileges. So it's nothing innocent, and it's very articulated. It's very intentional, and I think for an intentional act that buries others' humanity, we need to actually push back on as such, and also maybe create space for more people who have experienced caste oppression, and also be aware of the industries of this kind of wokeness that might come with the kind of activist circles.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys. Much gratitude. So, we're going to move to questions and answers. I think there are a couple mics moving through the audience. Please keep your question brief, and we want to hear from as many of you as possible. And then afterwards, we'll sort of be in the lobby, and there'll be books and connections. So, thanks. Please.
Thank you for
Thanks.
sharing your experiences with Caste. I just had a question about something Suraj,
Yeah.
brought up about how violence like reinforces those stratifications in caste, like because when it comes to racial discrimination, it's that violence aspect that really like triggers me. When you experience discrimination, the history of lynching, in the United States is kind of it's triggering because you think of the extent to what that discrimination might mean. How does that experience translate in the caste system?
You take a few, or you just want to answer?
Why don't we respond one by one?
Okay, thank you for your question. One of the challenges of caste system is whenever it receives any kind of pushback, the response unequivocally is violence, and it's very brutal violence. And the violence is not secret; it is meant to be demonstrative. And when you do that, if it's a woman, she's paraded naked, or her character is assassinated, or if there is a love between two people who happens to be of a different caste, the person from the higher caste makes sure that even the parents don't hesitate to murder their own children if they are from the dominant caste. And this is not a fiction. This is what you see, and that violence is fear. And we might talk about it, but to really experience that is a very visceral experience. And I think that's the way caste has been preserved. There's no sense of dialogue or justification, but it has to be met with violence. And in today's era, the violence is committed cycle. You go on social media, and again, the defenders of caste system who are committing violence by targeting you, your workplaces, and all of that, just because they want to hold on to their unmerited privileges.
Great, thank you. Okay, I have one back here.
Hi. Thank you so much for speaking. This is very interesting. My question is, from the conversations that I've heard about this topic, which admittedly are very few, I've heard a lot about comparisons between the black-white dichotomy and the Brahmin-Dalit dichotomy. Well, but my question is, obviously in India it's not a dichotomy, I guess. There's more castes in there. So I'd be curious to hear about maybe the way that there is or is not solidarity throughout the caste system in India, or how that manifests in different directions. Thank you.
I guess it's
Yeah.
I think it's a very, very good question, and I think going back to Isabel, she tries to chart that kind of hierarchy, and so in India there was a movement in Tamil Nadu especially, in my region Maharashtra as well, the Brahmin non-Brahmin movement, which basically was a solidarity of the majority of the people who were not given access to the Brahminical rituals and facilities. And in this non-Brahmin movement, there could be anybody from the feudal lord who is not a Brahmin to somebody who is just working in the field. And I think that solidarity was created in many ways to push back upon the dominance of Brahmins, but at the same time, the respect that it ought to give to the most marginalized, i.e. Dalit, was somehow left out, because the people with resources would like to trying to create their own space as an upmanship in trying to create this. And so that is a very huge dilemma. And I think this is what in the US too, it's very uncomfortable conversation to have, but we have this person of color and all that, and my black friends tell me it's an important category for us to have a solidarity, because as black people, they are minorities, and having a larger solidarity helps to, and this is also the case in India as well, you have to create, but does it really translate into change of society? Does it make any political impact? Does it help? And I think it does, on a personal private sphere it does, but a victim of what? A victim of white person, a victim of a class, a victim of the structure, that I think that ought to be clear. And I think in India too, one of the difficulties was victim of Brahminism as opposed to Brahmin. And I think that made much more sense for people to then align. Even Brahmins joined, because they were also, because Brahmins themselves have nearly 1,250 or 1,300 rather castes among them. So you might not even be the top. There will be somebody on top of you if you're even a Brahmin.
Yeah, I think I would add to that just that, it's just mind-numbingly complicated in India, and varies a lot by region as well. It's a huge country. So the dynamics of this can change radically from one side of the country to the other. There are all the other factors as well, like gender, and we haven't talked about religion is another factor that works into this, with Muslims and Christian and Sikh and other faiths that as well as castes also getting subdivided along lines of what they call scheduled castes in India, what are sometimes are called tribal or indigenous people in various parts of India, like where my family is from, Odisha. That's a big part of the dynamic there in particular. So I'm not really adding an awful lot, deciding to say it's very complicated. There are lots of spheres and overlapping areas that it's a lot to get through.
And I think at the same time, there's this intentional solidarity happening. You have to understand that there's this unintentional way in which caste is kind of mutating and trying to prevent the system from breaking down in some way. And so you can look at Italian and Irish immigrants coming to the U.S., right, who were not part of the dominant, and yet they got absorbed in this way. And we talked about Khalil Muhammad, who has this great book where he talks about, because there were the same kinds of social behaviors and criminality, and yet they were treated very differently by the legal system in the U.S., which perhaps is an extension of trying to strengthen the numbers of castes and keep this stratification in place.
Yeah.
There were some of the scheduled castes who were defined as criminals.
Yes.
Like you're racially defined as a criminal.
Do they still
under
call
the
it
British.
the backwards classes? In
No,
India?
They were the tribes, like for example, the nomadic tribes. And so there were some groups of people who were historically, even now they have.
Great. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thank you all for speaking. I think I have a similar question to the gentleman in the back, or the individual in the back, excuse me, about that sort of solidarity piece. And I'm wondering if sort of some or part of the answer lies in the economic incentives that you guys talked about a little bit earlier. So the fact that if I participate in this class system, eventually, if I work it right and I understand the system, I can be strong enough and I can be better enough to go into another country or another system where my money weighs more, or I'm able to have more economic opportunity. And I think that I see the same thing in America, especially as I sort of emerge into adulthood and like you have a full-time job and you understand that, yes, I want solidarity and yes, I want equality, but I also need to live and I need to sustain myself, and I exist within a system that requires me to do that and oppress someone else so that I can become better economically and so that I can have the things that you have, and so I can be in the positions that the greats were and are in. So I'm wondering how we can sort of leverage the class piece and the economic piece to build more of that interracial solidarity.
Beautiful.
That's my
Great question.
Amazing.
Great question.
Any takers?
Do you want to take it?
I'm offering space.
I mean, I think this is probably the most important indicator to to create solidarity. Not the only, but the most important, is according to my assessment, is because I think we have to recognize every history is not east-west, black-white, or it's always multi-layered, and the economic factors. I mean, just to piggyback on what Ravi was saying about Italian Americans, right? I mean, again, the hierarchy within Italian society. The book that I read at Phillip's house, which is the southern Italian culture as opposed to the northern Italian culture, and then there's a whole kind of complexity of that divide. I think the economic angle has to be not looked through necessarily the sense of finance or wealth or money. The economic, as in this context of a caste, has to look through the perspective of what it means to status. Like you may have the money, do you have the status? No, and the status comes from privilege of caste. So are we fighting for status? Most of the time, the demonstration of money is to acquire that status, is to have access to certain status. And I think this is why having a solidarity of class in this sense will make sense. But then the problem here is who will align with the definition of class. And if you align with a certain definition of class, most likely you have that background. But your life is not meant to live in that class for the rest of your generations. You're trying to upgrade. So I think that has to be sort of, complicated to kind of build the solidarity that we are hoping to build.
Great. Any last comments?
We have time for
Any
one
last-
more question.
One more question?
I think Phillip had.
That's
Yeah.
right. Phillip has a question. Please. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much. This is really enlightening. I worked and reported on this issue, but I learned a lot tonight. My question is about colorism, and the colorism in the context of caste, but not in India. I'm wondering about it in the context of places like Silicon Valley, where there was an effort, there was a lawsuit that I think folks know about. You can talk about that. And in the context of other professions in the U.S. Where you have South Asian communities. Wonder if you could talk about colorism, caste, in the context of where we are in this country, particularly in the high-tech industry.
That's great. I mean, because color and caste don't map directly on each other. In fact, I would probably be darker than some Dalits, for example. But it probably goes back to its roots. When I was in India, my aunts didn't want me to play cricket on the rooftop with my cousins because the sun, or the other neighborhood kids, because I would get too dark. And they had My Fair Lady skin bleaching whitening cream that they would use. And so there always was this idea of the aesthetic, and maybe some of that. And I should just bring in this colonialism piece, because I think before, there always had been this kind of intractable caste system, but it used to be, back in the days of the Maharaj, you could actually make a petition to maybe change your caste. You don't want to be a warrior. And the British codified and rigidified that system, and of course upheld their own ideals of aesthetics and beauty, and kind of passed it along. And I think still today there is this kind of, certainly in India and even over here, a kind of colorism piece.
Yeah, I mean, all the skin products and so on, and I talked about the scandal about my father marrying a white woman, but I got to say, My Fair Skin is really well appreciated. Movie star is like the shade of the skin tone, the compliment that I, yeah. So it's real, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys, for being here. Go read Correctional, get your copy, go read Caste Matters, catch Arun on the radio. Much gratitude, and we'll see you in the lobby.
Thank you.